Hello and welcome to another episode of Defense Uncut, the first dedicated English language Pakistani defense news and commentary podcast, where we unpack Pakistani military procurements, events, and broader strategic issues in focused detail so you can build a clearer and more accurate big picture. As always, I have with me Arslan Khan. How are you, Arslan?
I'm good. How are you?
I'm doing well. So we have a shorter itinerary this week, so let's just dive into the big topic that we have, which is that Azerbaijan has showed off its new JF-17 Block 3s. What are your thoughts?
Well, so these are airframes that were produced in 2024 and possibly delivered not too long ago, because I don't know if you remember, but there was that image floating around, and maybe you can add it to the video of I believe it was 9 JF-17s sitting on the tarmac at I think it was for like a Azerbaijan Independence Day, something like that. So there was some aircraft there. People speculated that these were Azeri aircraft, but the situation at the time was we assumed that the Azeris would paint theirs bright blue and like the MiG-29s. Now, today we found out that's not the case. They're the same Pakistan Air Force livery. So we see the Azeris have inducted their JF-17s. As I said, these were airframes produced in 2024. Now, that doesn't necessarily mean that a lot of people have been speculating that these are airframes that have been transferred from the Pakistani inventory themselves, which is not true. But a possible explanation behind the airframes and the delivery being so delayed is most likely what the case is. The crews had been training in Pakistan on these specific airframes, and then they were delivered once the crew had been trained back to Azerbaijan for their own use to operationalize them fully. Now, in terms of the Azeri J-17s, they seem externally identical in configuration to the Pakistan Air Force ones. Now, the key thing here is we've not seen what weapons they'll carry or what they will carry. However, or what they do carry. However, I'm pretty confident in saying that I assume it will be quite similar to what the Su-25s carry, the ones that they've had upgraded. So the Su-25s in the Azeri Air Force carry the SOM B1 cruise missile, the HGK bombs, which are like a JDAM, I believe. You've got Turkish laser-guided bombs, you've got the KGK series, and you've got the laser-guided, I think it's the Tebo series. So these are all weapons equipped on the Azeri Su-25s. Now, the interesting thing here is they're not integrated directly into the aircraft and its mission computers and all that sort of stuff, but they use an intermediary solution called the UBAS. I probably butchered that, which is basically a kind of like a adapter, right? The pylon, it sits between the aircraft's pylon and the munition, and it allows the pilot to launch the munition independent of the missile of the aircraft's mission system. So the Filipinos, they had a similar system where they would have effectively an iPad strapped to their kneeboard, and I believe the Turkish system kind of works similar as well. And there's other systems like this in use around the world as well. The Chinese have a system like this, which was exported to Serbia recently to equip their MiG-29s with the CM400 AKG. So they use an intermediary adapter in the middle, and I assume that this is something that will make its way into the JF-17 as well. So it could be quite interesting. We may end up seeing the JF-17s now carrying a new suite of munitions. However, there's always the chance that they could also be directly integrated into the airframes, but especially because Pakistan Aeronautical Complex is able to do the integration work. So this could also mean for the Pakistan Air Force as well. We could see possibly some deployment of the SOM or some procurement of the SOM. I don't think it's likely, but it gives the Pakistan Air Force some options, but also it gives them more options for export as well. So yeah, as I was saying, we've seen the Block 3s be inducted into the Azeri Air Force. Now, there's one thing I am a bit, it's all a bit up in the air on this matter. Is I don't know if there is a Block 3B. If we look at the picture of the aircraft in Azerbaijan, we see that there's some Block 3 features missing on the Bravo, which was parked far away. Particularly the tail-mounted missile approach warning system, but also the additional intake for the radar on the base of the tail. So I don't know whether there is a Block 3B. Maybe it's something that will come with time. Maybe it's something that is already there, and we've just never seen a close enough picture to figure it out. Maybe the missile approach warning sensors were placed elsewhere, and and the intake on the tail was placed elsewhere. Who knows? But the Azeris, as of now, it seems they've got 9 aircraft in their inventory in Azerbaijan, with a follow-up order probably being delivered sometime soon.
So in terms of the B, you're referring to the twin seater, right?
Yeah.
Yeah. So the twin seater, the JF-17B sits in this really weird category where it had been designed such that it would be compatible with many of the subsystems from the Block 3, including the active ESA radar. It does have the new flight control system from the Block 3 as well.
Yeah.
But because the PEF had expedited its development and purchase for their own training requirements, they had to basically deliver them as Block 2. So I guess a lot of the final configuration and uh, testing work is sort of contingent on the PEF proceeding with that order. So it's possible that they told the Azeris that at this moment we don't have a plan, or not a plan rather, we just haven't activated that route for the J-17B.
Yeah.
So they might recommend to the Azeris to use it as primarily a trainer, and in that capacity, the Block 2 equipment is fine. That being said, I think with Azerbaijan, because when we first talked about this last year around this time, it was that they essentially, it seemed that they had, according to the Pakistani government tweet that sort of revealed the 40 aircraft order, they had sort of implied that, or rather they stated that the order was worth quite a bit of money. It was like, I think what, like,
8
yeah.
billion.
And our we inferred from that was that the Azeris would essentially be paid, like, bankrolling the real, like, customization work.
Yeah.
And I think at one level, like, I'm not sure because we don't know, because we can't see what's within these aircraft right now.
Yeah.
But I did notice, even from the pilots who were shown in that Ministry of Defense video, and this could just be like just for PR purposes. I mean, there was no need for them to wear it, but I did not see the helmet-mounted display system that the
Yeah.
PF's Block 3s use. We haven't seen them obviously equipped with that many munitions yet, so it could be that it's still a work in progress. But if our theory holds true, then if the Azeris are paying for some significant customizations, we would essentially see JF-17s in their service with the Turkish subsystems and sensors and what have you.
Yeah.
Um, and then obviously for the PEF, that opens up another pathway should they choose, like, to either diversify their capabilities or maybe as like a follow-on, as like a midlife update option for the Block 2s, what have you. So there's that aspect as well,
Yeah.
worth that's worth tracking. And then obviously, I think from the Turkish side, the parts that really interest me the most is the fact that they have 2 ramjet powered air-to-air missiles in development. And we know that the PEF has been very happy with the PL-15, right, which is the Chinese, like, solid fuel rocket motor platform. But I think having a ramjet powered one, if only for understanding the kinetics in real life of how those operate, so you have a really good practical understanding of the Meteor, that would be a very good acquisition as well. And also to create a mix within your own air-to-air capability as well for India to deal with.
Yeah. The only thing I would say in terms of the helmet-mounted display system is it's not necessarily something that's always used. It's quite mission dependent. So you could have a J10 or a Block 3 where they aren't equipped with it in the moment, because obviously it weighs an amount as well. And when you're pulling G's, the weight multiplies. So it's not necessarily. I wouldn't necessarily say that because it's missing in the video that it's not a Block 3 or it's not being equipped. However, the alternative angle I would pitch to the large contract value is if you look at the airbase where they are, I forgot the name now, but I think it's Nasonia or something like this. If you look at the airbase where they're at, it's undergoing a very significant rebuild, basically. They've basically built entire new facilities for these aircraft. It's a very, very, very comprehensive upgrade. And I would possibly suggest that initially I had also suggested that the large contract value could be something to do with some bankrolling, some development and whatnot. But actually, I might now suggest that it may be more to do with like bankrolling Frontier Works organization to come out, or the Pakistan Engineering, Air Force Engineering to come out and build them new hardened aircraft shelters and new runways and taxiways and facilities at the airport, because it's a very, very significant upgrade, and stuff like hardened aircraft shelters aren't cheap to build. So yeah, that's the other angle I would push as well. is it could be something to do with that. A single HAS it could cost in excess of 5 to 10 million. Who knows? Especially some of the more modern stuff, they're very, very expensive. So that's also I would suggest that maybe even that's part of it as well here.
No, I agree. I agree. And it would make the most sense, right? At the end of the day, that's the most rational outcome. That it would make sense for Azerbaijan to go in with a frozen stock design of the J-17. So that would be your standard Block 3. And if we just said that the twin seaters might be Block 2, again, on the point that they just picked up whatever stock configuration the PF already had.
Yeah,
So with that, it would just make sense that they're basically the bulk of the spending is coming from them essentially not just rebuilding their infrastructure, but also sort of revamping and reworking their entire their entire doctrine as an air force. Because until this point, they largely, from what I understand, followed the Russian model,
yeah,
right? Very similar to Armenia. And now with the J-17, oh yeah, it's a Chinese platform, sure. But the point being is that it was designed for the PAF's, to say, hybrid model, basically, where they kind of have they've really based their doctrine, the training, the processes off NATO.
yeah,
It's just a Chinese platform that's sort of carrying it, but at the end of the day, it was built for that environment. That's the reason why I remember a few years ago when you were writing about promoting the J-17 to Argentina and the Latin American countries, the argument you made was literally that these Latin American countries, if their processes are largely modeled off after the US and NATO, but they have, for one reason or another, they cannot access the latest Western fighters. So that's where a platform like the J-17 slots in really well.
yeah. And the other thing I would suggest is I remember back from not too long ago, the Pakistan Air Force would publish well, they wouldn't publish marketing material, but you could get your hands on some marketing material for the JS17. They actually make a recommendation about, I think it was 2 or 3 Block 2, Bravos for, I forgot the amount of A's. So obviously, I assume they've sort of sold them like a standard package, like, hey, listen, you buy this many, you get this many of this and this many of that, and we'll throw in a house and we'll throw in this and that for you as well. Hell, they even talked about a warranty as well. So yeah, it's somewhere out there. I'll try and find it and mention it on the next episode if I can find it.
Yeah, I believe it was either 12 C's and 4 B's
Yeah, that's
or 14 C's and 2 B's or something like that.
yeah,
It was 16 aircraft, though. I remember that
yeah,
much. So you get one squadron, and also that recommendation, I believe, was modeled after the way the PAF had
yeah,
originally planned. I remember in Alan Warren's article where he mentioned that in addition to the dedicated J-17B squadron, they're also allocating, I believe, 2 J-17Bs to each frontline squadron as well,
yeah,
to continue with any training and acclimation purposes within the squadron. Because what was happening was that you're basically pushing younger and younger pilots now, because the bulk of your air force is now transitioned to four plus generation fighter aircraft. So it reasons that more and more of the because more and more of your units were operating these modern platforms, and
mhm,
there are fewer older platforms to sort of, I guess, acclimate your new pilots, that they're basically making pretty big jumps from the fighter conversion stage to operational stages, basically. Like
yeah,
you had the J-17 OCU unit, but that was still a pretty big jump. So they had to continue essentially maintaining the training structure even after the OCU stage. So it could be that that was the model that that essentially made it as part of the product, like, as part of the product offering,
yeah,
where you basically operate both the B and the C within the same squadron, essentially. So from there, we can then, and just to be clear, based on the serial number, there's no Block 5, right?
yeah. No, none of that.
Yeah, so it'd be interesting to see who got the 4 series number, because there's a Block 3, and then they gave the 5 series number. And just so our listeners are clear, we're referring to the serial codes of the Azeri fighters. So they have the year, which is 2024 or 24, and then they have a number called 502, 501, and then the 5 basically denotes the Azeri order. So
Yeah,
it'd be interesting to see where number 4 went, whether it went to a progressive upgrade or whether it went to a different customer. So that'll be interesting
yeah,
to unpack. Um, so we're just gonna jump from here. We're gonna actually jump into a couple of audience questions through email, because our listeners put in quite a bit of thought into these questions, and I felt it would be a good idea to give them space to sort of unpack and discuss in more detail, as opposed to putting them in the tail end. So the first question comes from Omar Farouk, again through email. So he's basically asking here. And then this is the email verbatim. So I've been reflecting on the idea of the PAF pursuing the Eurofighter Typhoon. So this is in reference to my comment about the Typhoon potentially being an option to the PAF. And he continues here. While I understand the argument for maintaining platform commonality with our defense pact partner Saudi Arabia and our close ally Turkey, I respectfully disagree that this alone justifies the acquisition. I know we are really struggling to keep the aging Mirages running, and since they are our primary strike platform, the Typhoon would theoretically be a fantastic multi-role replacement. However, it is simply too expensive. And I agree that we are in no rush to jump to a fifth generation fighter right now. My primary concern with the Typhoon is political. Germany would almost certainly never allow us to integrate our own conventional missiles onto the platform, let alone our strategic missiles for nuclear delivery. If what we desperately need right now is a reliable quote unquote bomb truck, why not look towards a platform like the JH-7B, or perhaps negotiate a new upgraded variant purposely built for the PEF? Alternatively, what are your thoughts of utilizing the Sea Sultan platform, which is the Pakistan Navy's long range maritime patrol aircraft, in a bomber configuration, acting as a sort of quasi bomber to launch heavy standoff missiles from a safe distance? I'd love to hear your take on whether a dedicated Chinese strike platform or a modified Sea Sultan makes more strategic sense and economic sense for our standoff needs than chasing a Western multi-role jet with heavy end-user restrictions. So I know, Arslan, you have some thoughts on this, but I'm just going to preface a couple of points so people know where we're sort of coming from. So the discussion here about the reason why I brought up the Typhoon as a potential option is to sort of point to the gravity of the PAF's next procurement cycle. So the PAF, if you look historically, tends to go in these like on and off decades of procurement. So it would make a decision in one decade, and then to the next decade, it would not really make any major procurements, but instead focus on inducting and operationalizing what it had ordered from the previous decade. Now, so that, for example, if you recall, the F-16 Block 52s, the F-16 midlife upgrade acquisition, the JF-17s, they were all sort of basically finalized in the late 2000s, and they sort of materialized through the 2010s. And then we had this weird, I guess, like midway period where in the late 2010s, early 2020s, we ordered the J-10 to also sort of drive the 2020s, whereas what normally would have happened was that we would have had a major big acquisition in the end of the 2010s to go into the 2020s, but certain things happened. One, you had the tension with India in 2019. Then you had obviously internal political problems. We're not going to get into too much detail about those because that's not our podcast. But nonetheless, whichever side you're on in that argument or that issue, the reality is at the end of the day, it has a significant impact on Pakistan and its ability to maintain procurement. And then obviously last year we had a conflict with India, which then necessitated another change in how we approached our procurement, which a massive spike in investing in drones, loitering munitions, obviously the formation of Army Rocket Force Command. So I think now like basically that next big cycle is going to get pushed to the late 2020s. So they're going to make a decision in the late 2020s, and then that decision will materialize through the 2030s. Now, what makes the 2030s particularly interesting is that the gravity of the 2030s is that our F-16 Block 15s, the ones we procured from the US back in the 80s, which had been upgraded, they're going to reach their OEM specified end of life date. So if you recall the contract the PAF signed with the Americans back in last year, they had basically, it was a $686 million upgrade deal with the US, mostly to support the F-16s. And literally within that announcement from the Department of War, Department of State, one of the two, they basically revealed that this package would basically be the last one until the F-16s are basically will reach their end of life date in 2040. So meaning that this is a package that will keep the PAF's Block 15s active until the year 2040, or meaning that in the 2030s, the replacement will start getting inducted. Now, when that date came out, it's not just the US telling the PAF that, hey, this is it. We're going to stop supporting the F-16s after 2040. Rather, it's the PAF and the US and Lockheed Martin discussing, okay, how long can we keep these F-16s active? How much juice do we have in the airframe? Can we extend the airframe any further? And then basically they all came to that conclusion that, okay, the support package is being negotiated until 2040. After that, the PAF said, probably, hey, we're going to replace these fighters by then anyways. And that's basically the context. The context being that the PAF has now an active plan in place to replace the 3 F-16 Block 15 squadrons by the year 2040, right? And this is a very, very, very significant project. It should not surprise anyone if the dollar value of this project would even exceed that of the JF-17, right? Because if you understand the role the F-16 plays within the doctrine of the PAF, you'll begin to understand where we're coming from. So the F-16s are the mainstay multi-role asset of the PAF. And I know we have the J-10Cs, we have the J-17 Block 3s, sure. And those provide that cutting edge technology. But what the F-16s provide is durability and reliability. Because they have been designed and maintained in such a way, with the PF having a very incredibly deep logistics and support base within the force, with many trained personnel, with many, obviously, many ties with the not just Lockheed Martin or not just Lockheed Martin, but with many third-party suppliers for spare parts and what have you. They understand how to operate this bird to like perfect. The way they understood the Mirage, they understand the F-16. And if not for the fact that there's no additional service life extension program, they would have probably would have preferred keeping these planes active longer if they could, maybe even upgrade them. But at this point, 2040, that's how much juice these airframes have. And for air headquarters, they know that no matter what, they can always tap in an F-16 squadron, right? Like they know for sure the level of reliability and uptime that they're going to get out of the F-16s. Doesn't mean they don't know about the J-10s or J-17s, but I'm just trying to point out that the F-16 has been this trusted warbird, right? It serves a very particular function. It is your first responder. It is always there in every operation, whether it's offensive or defensive. It's the thing that they will always refer to and integrate alongside a J-17 formation or a Mirage formation or a J-10 formation. So it plays that role. And when you think about that, you do not want to replace that whole that because this is 3 squadrons again. They 3 mainstay squadrons, 60 aircraft. That's a big chunk. You do not want to replace that with a specialized niche fighter that might have uptime issues between sorties, which is typically the case with a stealth fighter because of the stealth skin and what have you. A stealth fighter is a very specialized asset meant for a very specialized set of missions, right? So that's the reason why we are sort of a little hesitant of. I said that the PF is looking. I believe the J-35 is the number 1 contender, but not for the reasons people think. I think for the PEF, it's not so much that it's a stealth fighter, but that's the only ostensibly available medium to heavyweight platform with a better strike capacity or better payload capacity than what they have right now. And no one else is offering ostensibly anything else at the moment. Like if the Chinese flankers like the J-16 could be an option, I'm sure the PF would prefer that over the J-35, like frankly, because you look at the J-16, right? It is a mainstay fighter of the People's Liberation Army Air Force. It serves this massive role, right? It's they treat it as their main workhorse, right? I mean, the J-10s operate as a defensive air defense platform within their own territory. The J-20 is a specialist stealth fighter, but the J-16 is the mainstay multi-role fighter, right? And they know the capacity it brings, and you see it from the developmental updates. You know, they went from the J-11B to J-11BS to the J-16, like the J-16D and so on. Like you see how many upgrades and variants of that fighter came out, and you contrast that with the J-10, and it stopped at the J-10C, basically, right? So that should tell you something where even the Chinese have kind of invested their priorities. So that's the issue here. So for this role, and now you're the PEF, you have this opportunity perhaps where you could potentially pursue a larger, heavier aircraft to fill in, and that's where the J-35 would seem to be the number 1 option. And it is, frankly, because it's the one that we know for sure that's on offer. And maybe there's many aspects to the design of the J-35 that we're missing on our end. Maybe it's not as like a, let's say maybe the Chinese have figured out a way to design a stealth fighter without the maintenance overhang, right? Maybe they've designed, or maybe it's been designed, maybe the J-35 export version has been designed in a simpler way. We don't know. But those are all possibilities. But the fact is that the F-16s play that very integral mainstay mainstay multi-role role. And from there, it kind of goes from there downstream. Is that okay? If you would need a replacement for this fighter, what would it be? And number 1, you would look for a big, massive existing support base. You would look for a fighter that is operated by many countries, so that in those off situations where, for whatever reason, spare parts and supplies are hard to come by, you know that other countries would have them. Definitely nearby partners like the Saudis, the Omanis, and what have you, having it is a big plus. Definitely Turkey investing in it at this point is also a big plus, because if you look at it from the Turkish standpoint, any delay to the Khan means that the Typhoon would probably get more orders and more support. And then obviously you can argue that the Turks having an aerospace industry of their own, they might have a long-term incentive of taking over parts of the Typhoon's production and what have you in the long run. So you know that the longevity is going to be there. And then obviously the investment in munitions and support and what have you. And obviously cost. Now, if you take all those factors, if you're the PAF, you might prefer replacing old F-16s with new F-16s, especially the same ones based off the Block 52 airframe. That probably is their preferred option because they already have the aircraft. They already have the Block 52, so they can immediately induct the Block 72 without any major difficulty. But that's the context that we're coming in from, and that's why I said don't discount the Typhoon. I'm not saying the PEF is the Typhoon's number one. No, I'm not saying that. I'm saying just don't discount it, right? Don't assume that the J-35 is going to run away with this. Just treat the J-35 as the number one, and then be open-minded towards other options because this is the context that PF is dealing with. So over to you, Arslan.
Sweet. So I'm going to just break this down into multiple bits because there's a lot to talk about here. So firstly, if we read his question, so PF, okay. So in terms of the keeping the aging Mirages running, I think while I understand where you're coming from, I don't really think it's a valid argument, and that's not me trying to hate on you. But let me explain why. The Mirage is just that it's just old, right? It's just old. There's no stockpiles of spare parts anywhere. There's no people making spare parts. There's no active production lines for it. There's no OEM support. There's literally nothing. The Mirage is as like worst case as it gets. There is no support, zero support. The Pakistan Air Force purchased everything it could. There are companies that support the Mirage in Pakistan, and they stockpile any parts they can find in their own warehouses, anticipating Pakistan Air Force orders. But even now, they're struggling to find any parts. They've scoured everywhere, bought everything from South Africa and the Arabs and whoever else, Australia, wings and engine parts. There's just nothing left. So the Pakistan Air Force is really struggling to keep the aging Mirages running because firstly, they were end of life decades ago, right? But now they are really end of life. Like all of the new wings we bought, whatever, they've all been expended as well. So it's kind of they're struggling to keep them running, but that's because they've far outlived their design life. These aircraft should have been retired 20 years ago, 30 years ago. But they've been pushed on and on. Hell, 30 years ago wasn't that long. 40, 50 years ago. The point is these aircraft have been pushed on for so long that them struggling to run isn't necessarily a dig. And actually, it's quite at this point, it's quite impressive that they're still running. It's not. I wouldn't really be able to use that as an argument there. But what I agree with you. The Typhoon would be a great replacement. But you say it's too costly. Now the thing is all of these aircraft all of these modern aircraft in this kind of category are all quite similarly priced. Maybe obviously the Typhoon is probably on the upper end. I completely agree with you when compared to something like a Block 72 F-16. But all of these aircraft tend to be in this like multi-$100 million price bracket. With the Typhoon, it would definitely be on the upper end of that scale because you'd need to induct a lot of new stuff, a new contract. There'd be new contractors, new support programs, new sustainment, new facilities, new weapons, everything. Like it's pretty worst case scenario. Again, it's everything new. And in terms of cost, I want to present a slightly different argument. So there was a King's College article on the operating cost of the Typhoon and the F-35. Obviously, the reason why they compare this is because obviously they're both in service in the UK. But so based on a 2025 report from the US, the cost per flight hour of the F-35 fell below $50,000 for the first time. It was about $47,000, which is very impressive. And the cheapest aircraft in the US inventory in terms of cost per flight hour was the F-16C at $32,000. The older F-16s will be higher than this. And if we look at the Typhoon, the earliest verifiable cost numbers we have that are as sort of solid as it gets is the is the Austrians. And the Austrians, to be honest, had a very bad time with the Typhoon, but this was because they were one of the earliest adopters. And in fact, the Austrian Typhoons weren't even BVR capable. So that's how old we're talking. This was in 2007. So they really struggled, and they tried to sell them actually for bargain basement prices. I don't know if anybody bought them, but it was kind of to the point where they weren't actually worth upgrading. So the Austrians never upgraded them; they just sold them off and then replaced them with new ones. And the Austrians, they reported a cost per flight hour in 2010 of 27,000 euros. And then in 2011, they reported a cost per flight hour of 81,000 euros. Now, this was this spike is obviously significant, but it came due to a really sharp increase in costs over. They did 1,051 flight hours in that year, so it came over a sharp cost increase in that. But the problem was with these numbers is at the time, the Austrian Air Force was one of a handful of operators, and they were operating the first version of the aircraft. This was when production wasn't mature and support wasn't mature, and there wasn't, there was a lot of issues. Again, this was kind of the worst case scenario at the time. If and the author sort of made a cost comparison, you can call it, where there was showing how scale affected the costs using the F-35's cost structure. And basically, what it was it works out that the cost per flight hour of the Typhoon wasn't like prohibitively more expensive than the F-16 CD, which was the cost difference was about $15,000 an hour, which obviously is still significant, but that's probably very close to what the older F-16s are costing at the moment, or hell, maybe even similar to what the Mirage 5 costs us. So I don't really necessarily think the cost per flight hour is prohibitive as people make it out to be. But also, you need to look at it from a capability angle, right? If you can put one Typhoon, if one Typhoon can do the job that two JF-17s can do, in terms of cost per flight hour, the numbers are going to start to get skewed pretty heavily in the Typhoon's favor, because the Typhoon can carry a lot of ordnance very far and deliver it very well. You might need 2, 3 JF-17s to do the same thing. So it's kind of also, you need to look at it from the angle of what capability this cost is going to bring. Now, I understand Pakistan as a cost is a nation limited in resources, but at the end of the day, we're going to need to accept the reality that the Pakistan Air Force needs to shrink in numbers, and it might not do it now, but at some point it needs to. There is no way the Pakistan Air Force, and even the Indians for this matter, I mean, maybe if they carry on growing like they are, but the Pakistan Air Force cannot sustain this number of aircraft with modern ones. At some point, they're going to need to start cutting squadrons. If we look at the cost of the 5th generation fighters and 6th generation fighters, the 6th gens are predicted to cost multi-hundreds of millions of dollars. The Pakistan Air Force isn't going to be able to sustain these kind of numbers for very long. I think we're kind of at the point where we're going to start seeing declining squadron strength, and that's by plan. Swap these aircraft out for more capable, higher cost aircraft and have a very well integrated but smaller force. I think that's just a reality. Or we'll see once again a very sharp tip of the spear with very capable strike assets, but then the supporting assets once again being these sort of low cost aircraft. So in terms of your cost point, I just don't think the cost is much as big as a deal as people make it out to be. And I know people will cite the Turkish example. Now, the Turks paid 500 and something million dollars per Typhoon if you look at the numbers, if you take the numbers at face value. But what people fail to understand is the Turkish Typhoon contract was huge in terms of support sustainment, and also the fact that the Turks are wanting to integrate their own weapons into the Typhoon. And at some point, the Turks needed to create the economic incentive for the designers of the Typhoon as well to greenlight a sale, right? And this is the same argument I'll make for the F-16 Block 72 as well. Is if Pakistan was able to go, or in this case, if Turkey went to Oman, Saudi Arabia, and whatnot, and just bought their second-hand aircraft, what's in it for the Germans? What's in it for the Brits? What's in it for anybody? Nothing. They might get a couple of sustainment contracts, but that's nothing. In the same way, if Pakistan Air Force went to the boneyard and picked up a couple of F-16s and then did the upgrades, what's in it for Lockheed? Maybe a couple $100 million versus the billions of a off the shelf buy. So at some point, these countries are going to need to create like an economic incentive for the others as well to go ahead and greenlight the sales. And your primary concern with the Typhoon is political, and the Germans not allowing us to integrate our own conventional missiles onto the platform, let alone strategic missiles for nuclear delivery. And I would just make the point here is nobody's going to let you integrate nukes I don't even think the Chinese will onto the J-10, right? The J-17 was initially envisioned as a nuclear strike asset, and there's a press release by a Chinese embassy actually saying that this aircraft is capable of delivering nuclear and conventional missiles. However, nobody's going to allow you to integrate nuclear missiles onto these strike assets, but that doesn't mean it can't be done. Now, this is the difference, right? The Pakistan Air Force can go ahead and buy whatever it needs to, and if push comes to shove, there's nothing stopping them from. I don't know if you recall earlier, I mentioned the robust solution, the Turkish one, which was that interface. And there's nothing stopping the Pakistan Air Force from doing a similar solution, right? But on top of that, integrating our unconventional missiles into the platform, the Pakistan Air Force doesn't really have. I know we see a lot of flashy designs and stuff, but they don't really have any of that. A lot of Pakistan's standoff weapons and munitions revolve around kits that can be attached to dumb bombs. And again, this is stuff that can be interfaced via the Turkish solution, and I'm sure the Chinese, whatever. The point is that's something that can be interfaced via these adapters, and that's something the Indians are looking at with the Rafale as well. So is it? I just don't think it's that far fetched, and I don't think the Germans or anybody for that matter would be too opposed to the Pakistan Air Force. As you could make the counter-terrorism argument or something. We need these range extension kits to be able to launch strikes into Afghanistan or Iran or whatever. You can make that argument. So I don't think it's as like significant as it's made out to be. Yeah, and after all, the Germans have supported Pakistani defense programs for up till recently. We saw new German radars in Pakistan Air Force service. The Germans supply the Pakistan Navy with torpedoes, and they supplied sonar equipment for the Augusta upgrade. There's lots and lots of support from the Germans to Pakistan. And your next point is, if we desperately need a reliable bomb truck, why not look towards the platform like the JH-7B, or perhaps negotiate a new variant purposefully built for the PAF? Now, what I'm going to say here is the JH-7B is basically dead, right? Like, it's a very old platform. And the best analog is that looking at the Indian Jaguar saga. The Jaguar is basically functionally, it's the same thing, right? It's a strike asset, old design, blah blah blah. The Indians had a upgrade program with Honeywell planned for, I think it was 80 units, 80 engines, or 80 aircraft being upgraded with new Honeywell engines. The same ones used in that Taiwanese aircraft. I forgot the designation, but the Indians were basically looking to retrofit new engines to the Jaguar fleet. This was coming at a cost of $30 million per airframe. That's one JF-17 per airframe just for the engines. So when we talk about upgrading, upgrading these aircraft, it's not a conversation to have, really. The Chinese don't have an engine in class, not a modern one. Off the top of my head, I could be wrong here, but the point is the Chinese don't really have anything in class to upgrade into this. So we need to fund the development. We'd not only fund the development of an appropriate engine or a modification of an appropriate engine, we'd also need to fund the development of all the modifications we make. This upgrade or upgraded aircraft would probably cost more than a Typhoon procurement off the shelf anyway. It's just not feasible, and also the time it would take would it'd take 5, 6, 10 years even. Who knows? It just isn't something feasible. But also, I just don't think the Chinese have any interest in these kind of like funky projects that they would once upon a time. Like if you approach China now, like with some money and say, hey, look, we want to throw this money at you. Can you develop us an aircraft? I don't necessarily think they'd be too interested anymore. They have a very good portfolio of aircraft available for export. They've got the production lines. They've got everything built. Everything's mature. I assume they would kind of just pipeline you towards those. And in the same way, instead of if you approach the Chinese like, hey, look, I want to upgrade your JH-7s, they'd probably just say, hey, well, why don't you just buy these J-35s instead? Functionally, it's quite similar. You can do the same things with it. You might carry less weapons, but you can do the same things functionally. So again, I just don't really think the JH-7 argument is something that's too feasible. One thing I forgot to mention is also the Typhoon. A lot of the countries in the Typhoon consortium are really desperate, particularly the British, are really desperate to keep their production lines open, because if the production line falters, the British are basically losing an industry. They're losing their aircraft engineering building industry. So the Brits were really desperate to keep the Typhoon production line open. And if the Turkish order hadn't come through, it would have basically closed down and the Brits would have lost that capability. And that would have been a massive loss to the UK. So I would maybe even go as far as to say that you could probably put a fair bit of arm twisting on the consortium members, because you could then have them, for example, if you say the Germans are a roadblock, the Brits did a fair bit of lobbying to get the Turkish Typhoons deal to happen, right? The Germans are always blocking this, but look, the Germans have folded, and the Turks are now getting their new build Typhoons. It's very beneficial for the British industry, which was faltering, and it keeps the production line running for a few more years. But then obviously we're going to be back in this position again, and unless GCAP is built, we're going to be back in this position again where the Brits are going to be scrounging for orders to keep the production line alive. And the other thing I would say is Pakistan probably has a fair bit of favor in Europe with their assistance to Ukraine, and Pakistan could get even more favor in Europe by continuing to support Ukraine, which we've made the case for, and I think is the best thing Pakistan can do for itself and also for Ukraine and for its image in Europe. But Pakistan really should go more into Ukraine because it helps us with projects like these as well. The Europeans would be interested in, the Europeans would have we'd have some more favor with the Europeans to sell us more kit or to create deals with whatever, or even if you think back to like the I think the old days where the US was willing to bankroll like European fighter procurement for the Pakistan Air Force, or encouraging countries to sell the Pakistan Air Force. So there's some there's a lot of angles that can be played here. Now, you next mentioned, alternatively, what are your thoughts on utilizing the Sea Sultan in a bomber configuration, using it as a quasi-bomber to launch heavy standoff missiles from a safe distance? Now, my opinion on this is basically the same thing as using as the Rapid Dragon system. So a lot of people mentioned, we should do something similar with our C-130s. And just some context, what Rapid Dragon is basically a palletized system that fits into the back of the C-130, and it can be equipped with standoff munitions, and using C-130s to launch them out the back. So you could launch, 12 or whatever Larasams or JASSMs out of a C-130, and then it go and do a cargo mission. So my opinion on this is basically the same thing as that for the Pakistan Air Force. Is I just don't think it works, right? Now, initially, the Sea Sultan is, I believe, was initially envisioned to be a bomb truck anyway. The original contract was to, Leonardo was to develop a rotary bomb bay for the aircraft, which again, what aircraft have that? The B-1 Lancer, the B-52. It's obviously that's something that they're looking into. It would be equipped with standoff missiles like the Temur anti-ship and Rasub, and other similar missiles, and I hope maybe our own quick sync type solution one day. So yeah, it's something that's already sort of being envisioned, but I think it's for a very specific purpose. Again, the maritime strike purpose. You really don't want to take these assets away from their current roles. While we have large numbers of the Sea Sultan plan, it's still not big enough to be able to divert to split the fleet up into one doing bombing missions, one doing anti-ship and anti-submarine warfare. Because the thing here is firstly, losses. These can't be replaced. The Sea Sultans, they will not be replaced like an F-16 can be replaced, or a JF-17 can be replaced. But on top of that, they're specialists for their role. If you need a bomb truck, the F-16 can do a really good job at being a bomb truck. The F-16 is a great bomb truck, and it's actually probably the most capable air-to-ground fighter in our inventory. The F-16 can't, however, do anti-submarine warfare. Taking away the Sea Sultan from its main role of anti-submarine warfare, anti-ship warfare is not going to be, is going to be far from ideal. The Sea Sultan allows the PAF to offload, to remove some of the burden off the PAF to protect the southern coast, because the Sea Sultan can go ahead and do the anti-ship strikes that the PAF was initially envisioned to do, or even the naval air arm Mirage squadrons. Even those, I think those are retired now, but you don't need those anymore. You don't necessarily need like a fighter-based naval strike force anymore, because the Sea Sultan is basically capable of doing that. But also, the Sea Sultan is already going to be stretched very thin as well, because it's also due to act as like a command and control node, or an airborne early warning node, but even like a sensor shooter type situation as well. So it's a platform that's already going to be stretched very thin. However, again, it does have the capabilities of what you're suggesting, or it will. Maybe I think the Bombay thing was up in the air a little bit towards the end, but yeah, on that front, again, I just don't think it's possible. And the C-130, people, again, let me just touch on the C-130 argument as well, because I think that's something people mention as well, is the Pakistan Air Force transport fleet is compared to the size of the force, it's quite small. But also the C-130s are old; they're struggling. Well, when I say they're struggling, relatively compared to like something like a Herc, as compared to the new ones like a J. But and obviously the Pakistan Air Force is really trying to ensure that they're used for what they're made for use. Sidhu, when he came in, he made it so you couldn't take a C-130 for a flight with your family. Obviously, I'm exaggerating a little bit there, but basically they increased the kind of usage restrictions on these aircraft to preserve their airframe life, which is so. These are specialists for what they're made for, and there just isn't the ability to allocate them elsewhere. If you get what I mean. So again, I just don't think diversifying the roles and the missions of these aircraft beyond what they already are is going to be beneficial for them or the force. I think a strike platform. In the end, I think what's going to happen is that when the Pakistan Air Force is going to replace F-16s with F-16s, there is no better supported aircraft in the world than the F-16. There are 2,100 F-16s, in excess of the 2,100 F-16s in service globally. And these aircraft, I think the F-16 will probably be one of the only fighters, if not the only fighter, that will touch 100 years old. The production line is going strong. The new builds have a service life of 40 years, which can even further be extended. Like Lockheed has done tests where they found that the 12,000 hours is still nothing. They can still push it even further, 16, 20,000 hours, if somebody funds it. At that point, you're kind of like, how much longer can you push these aircraft? But the F-16 can go on for another decade beyond what's initially envisioned. So I think in the end, what's going to happen is the Pakistan Air Force is going to end up replacing the F-16 with the F-16, which is the best option. The F-16 is a very capable strike fighter, very capable ground attack aircraft, but also the support fleet in Pakistan as well is very significant. For example, the Pakistan Air Force is even capable of upgrading the engines to the I think it's the EEP, which is kind of the new the new variant of the Pratt and Whitney engine, which was found on the Block 52s, so 52s and 52 pluses. So the older ADFs and the Block 15s, they were upgraded. The engines would have been done in house, for example. So the F-16, I think, is going to be staying, and I think the F-16s will be replaced with the F-16s because, again, they're the aircraft that if the Pakistan Air Force needs to go on a mission and they say, well, listen, which one of our aircraft can we depend on? It's going to be the F-16. The F-16 has arguably some of the best reliability anywhere in the world. It's got some of the most available. It's got some of the greatest availability numbers anywhere in the world, and the same will apply for the Pakistan Air Force as well. As I said, I think the F-16B is the best option, and it will be the best option. There's a backlog on the production line, so I think if something is to be signed, it'll be signed within the next few years, and we'll see some deliveries in the 2030s. The other interesting angle is again, as I mentioned earlier, you're going to need to kind of sweeten the deal for these countries. You're going to need to say you're going to need to go to some US senators and say, hey, look, listen, I can create a couple more jobs in South Carolina for you. Let me give you a contract for 20 F-16Bs, for example, and then you can go back to them and say, look, well, listen, I've done this for you. Let's go to the boneyard. And there are based off of the numbers, there are I think 170 plus F-100 based aircraft in the in the boneyard, and then with the GE ones, there's a lot more, but there are Pratt and Whitney F-16s in the boneyard. Now, these aircraft are going to need structural enhancements, so they are effectively end of life. But again, the F-16 can have its life extended with some structural enhancements. So there is some scope there to pick up some of these aircraft to put them through the SLEP and to then put them through the V upgrade and give us another 20 years of service. And then the new builds, they can soldier on for another 40 to 50 years. 2030s. If they start being delivered in 2030s, you'll see Pakistan Air Force operating F-16s into the 2070s. So nearly 100 years. It's an insane number. It's just a testament to the reliability of the F-16 platform. There's a global supply chain. Anywhere you go, you know that somebody will be able to support the F-16. It's just a great aircraft. And again, the Pakistan Air Force, has hinted towards upgrades. If we saw the most recent sustainment program, we saw the statement put out by the Department of War for AIM-120C8, which was pushed back on by the Indians, and then the the U.S. embassy in India pushed back and said, "Listen, it's not the case. It's just a sustainment package." But then we saw signals to the otherwise. If we look at the most recent sustainment package for the F-16, that it included AGU-891 missile test equipment, which is the test equipment needed for used on the AIM-9X and also the AIM-120D and C8. So again, there's more indication here that what the correction placed by the U.S. Embassy in India may not necessarily be the most accurate or the most representative. Obviously we saw the procurement of more Link 16 terminals as well, 94, I think, which is a significant number. The Pakistan Air Force F-16s already are equipped with Link 16. The Block 52s are all equipped with Link 16. I assume the MLUs are as well. So what are these 92 Link 16 terminals for? Again, who knows? But I think there's some indications here to say that the Pakistan Air Force is going back to its roots, and will end up buying some more F-16s, which again is the best choice. The Pakistan Air Force knows the F-16 in and out. The crews know the F-16 in and out. They love it. It's a great aircraft. It's a very reliable aircraft, and even despite the ups and downs we have with the US. If you look back, the US had to scrap basically any mention of the F-14. They scrapped everything to do with the F-14, so the Iranians couldn't get their hands on them and keep their fleet running. They still got them. They still managed to keep them running. The F-16 has over 2,000 airframes in service around the world, and it's planned to run until the 2070s. If worst came to worst, the US is not keeping the Pakistani F-16s from flying. They will continue to fly. Venezuelan F-16s carried on flying. As I said, Iranian F-14s and F-4s kept on flying. The Pakistan Air Force is capable of keeping these aircraft flying, and they usually tend to front load a lot of the equipment needed to keep them flying to ride out those rough periods with the US. So I hope that answers everything well. I'm sure I've missed out some stuff. When I start talking, I forget things. So if I have, please leave it in the comments, and then we'll touch on it next episode. So I'll throw it back to Bilal now.
Yeah, thanks, Arslan. So, I just want to also caution a little bit on the refrains on costing. So, when we look at a Western fighter procurement program, in a lot of cases, except for the shadiest deals imaginable, right? In a lot of cases, the pricing gets disclosed, and you have a very relatively speaking a pretty clear understanding of what's going into the capital acquisition side, which is like your new build fighter aircraft, and what's going into the long-term operational side. And what ends up happening is that these contracts that, let's say, like, for example, the Turkish Eurofighter contract, or even like the many F-16 Block 72 contracts, they tend to include that full number, right? At least up to like minimum up to 10 years, maybe even longer. So that number does not tell you, basically it's the number that gives you the complete story. Now, where it gets interesting with the PAF is that if in the 2030s you're going to retire the F-16 ABs, which you are, I mean, it's not if, it's when, your OpEx budget is going to get freed up quite a bit, right? So because once those F-16s go out, that is money being spent every year in their maintenance. And yes, for a Western fighter, they are low cost, but for a country like Pakistan, they are, they cost money. It's not insignificant. It's a significant amount of money, but from, the point being is that the point being is that with the F-16s, once the EPF retires the Block 15s, its OpEx budget is going to get freed up quite a bit. So when the PF is going to go out negotiating for that next fighter aircraft, right, it's actually going to have quite a bit of budgetary power to play with, right? So basically, obviously the upfront is going to be where most of the challenge is going to be, but they know that when it comes to the OpEx side, they'll be able to, absorb that within the annual budget pretty well. So, and the annual budget is also, increasing every year as well for the time being. So they know they're going to have more money to operate with. Now, obviously with the Chinese, there's a lot of factors we just don't know about. So, it's not, for example, with the J-35, they might, because they want to really export it to the world, I think they are ramping it up to be a highly exportable fighter. So they might take up some of the upfront cost in that. They might try to make the price tag very competitive, right? There are a lot of these factors that are going to go into play, and that's why it's going to be the number one option. But when it comes to the other side, in addition to what Arslan has said, I don't want to just say it's going to be cost that's going to make the PF decide. The PF is going to probably take a variety of factors into consideration. And when it comes to cost, well, the easiest way to absorb cost easily is to basically leverage the infrastructure you already have, which is why, to Arslan's point, the preferred option to replacing the old F-16s will be new F-16s, just as the preferred option for replacing old C-130s is new C-130s, right? So that's where the top line is for the PAF. Now, in regards to also, I just want to add in terms of like the reason why I would say like the Typhoon is like, let's say, a number 3 option here, is that um, the, in addition to the points I raised with regards to the Turks now coming in, I want to establish that, you know, with Turkey entering this into the, not maybe the consortium, but entering in as a customer, it's like a very big deal, right? Because they're acquiring this fighter at a pretty late stage of its life cycle. So the point being is that, you know, all that teething, all the hiccups with the, for example, what Austria dealt with, all those have been ironed out. In fact, even when it comes to the operational side of the Typhoon, you know, what happened at the beginning of the 2020s, that the UK initiated what they call, I believe it was the Titan, so which is basically, it's like the Typhoon, Typhoon Total Availability Enterprise. So that's basically, it was a structured supply chain effort to reduce the cost of the Typhoon by over 1/3, and to ensure that the new build units would also be uh, much more affordable to operate compared to the older variants. So when we're talking about the Typhoon T3, I believe that also T4 and so on, they are operationally lower cost compared to the T1 and T2. Basically, is a basic point here. And in addition to that, if you look at the Turkish contract, you have to also keep into account that the Turks are not only acquiring, you know, the D-level MRO facilities, meaning that they'll be able to service their Typhoons and everyone else's Typhoons, but they're also bringing in offsets, meaning that for every dollar they spend on the Typhoon, the consortium has to basically spend a significant chunk of that back into the Turkish economy or buy back Turkish systems. So, for example, right now you have Germany ostensibly, according to Turkish media, looking into Turkish ballistic missiles, for example. So there are those factors at play as well that also add, in a sense, to the cost, because for the governments involved, they're saying, hey, like, this is a foreign currency trade issue here. So if we're going to like give you offsets, it needs to be really worth our dollar, and you know, you're getting into investments and what have you. So point being is that there are a lot of those factors at play as well. So just to keep that in mind. So that's where I just want to add that as well as additional context. And finally, the other point is that, you know, even the PF is not even going to use it won't even use the J-35 for any nuclear delivery role. I think at this stage, you know, with the development of the ballistic missile stack and what have you, I think in general, if you look at it the way where we have the Fatah program, the Timur program, whatnot, Pakistan is very consciously trying to establish that its long range munitions are not going to be for nuclear purposes. Rather, it's being very intentional in framing its ongoing procurement goals and from the perspective of conventional capability, because at the end, what's starting to really become apparent, and if it hasn't already for folks, is that India doesn't care about the nuclear overhang anymore, right? They want to persist in fighting that conventional conflict because they've sort of sensed out that, hey, like, Pakistan's nuclear deterrence threats, they're not like, they
But
control the threshold to such an extent where Pakistan cannot even initiate that conversation. So now even Pakistan has sensed that, and that's why Pakistan is investing in those conventional capabilities as well. So we're seeing a general emphasis on building the conventional capability, and obviously Pakistan can then go back and argue that by strengthening the conventional side, it reduces the pressure on the nuclear side of the equation as well. So there are all those factors, and another one is in terms back to cost and financing. One of the challenges that the Pakistan has had with procuring European weapons since the 90s was that with the drawdown of the Cold War and the increased dependence on U.S. security guarantees, the Europeans actually did wind back a lot of their defense spending. And in tandem with that defense spending, they also had wound back a lot of the loans and credit that they had available for countries like Pakistan. So, you know, I think some people will say that, you know, we'll kind of frame things very simplistically, saying that, hey, like, if Pakistan tries to negotiate with, you know, the Typhoon Consortium, the India will sort of, you know, 3x, 4x and offer a bigger deal to Europe. However, if you actually look back at the history, India always had that advantage in Europe. You could always buy more than Pakistan, but that didn't stop the European countries from exporting to Pakistan. And the reason being was that the European vendors like Dassault and like DCNS and now Naval Group, and others as well, they could always tap into the European governments for basically credit and loans that they can basically back their purchases with. And Pakistan would use those loans to basically finance this, you know, equipment like the Mirages, the Daphne class submarines, and what have you. Now, what happened after the Cold War was that money dried up. So now the Europeans were much more strict with how they were going to lend out money for defense procurement, and that's where the deals that were done on cash really started to matter more, and that's where India got that advantage, right? And that's where you saw the French sort of pivot away from Pakistan. That's where you see the Germans sort of also to a big extent sort of guard their defense ties with India, and not upset them through sales of Pakistan. But what happened since the U.S. Since the Russia-Ukraine war, since in the second Trump admin and the I guess like the U.S. saying that, hey, we're not going to guarantee your security, is that the European financing mechanisms are actually coming back online. So they have initiatives like SAFE, which are essentially there to help with loans and credit to third-party markets as well. Basically, the Cold War era European industry is coming back, and they have they have outlays planned for about up to nearly €1 trillion a year in basically basically in programs that are going to be coming out in Europe. So for the next decade, they're planning to spend up to €10 trillion in that decade on different defense programs, and that means that's a lot of financing now out in the open, right? And these all these countries want a piece of a pie. They want to support their local employment. They want their local industries to boom, right? You look at a country like India. How much are you going to realistically absorb, right? In terms of those European market demands. So, for example, you have European markets literally asking for jobs and what have you for their economies. Then you have India, which is basically mandating Make in India, transfer of technology, domestic production, and what have you. You can literally see that this is becoming a sticking point for the in the Indian-French Rafale negotiations. So it's going to basically get amplified. I mean, we talk about Germany. Well, German employment is at risk due to the fact that China is again economically has advanced so much that Chinese goods are outcompeting German goods on pricing, right? So every export order that supports German manufacturing, British manufacturing, Spanish manufacturing, Italian manufacturing, it counts. It counts towards something, and when it's backed by more readily available loans and credit, it ends up working out for countries like Pakistan. Because remember, at the end of the day, back in the 50s and 60s, I mean, if you look at, for example, when the PAF was buying Mirages from the French, prior to that, the Indians had bought many more numbers of French aircraft, right? Like the Mystiers, for example. Did that stop the French from selling Mirages to Pakistan? No, not really, because the French companies and OEMs knew that they could tap into the financing and basically get those deals going, and they wanted to essentially accumulate every potential customer they could get, including Pakistan. And we might, in this more middle power centric environment, might be entering that. That being said, I mean, to Arslan's point, if you're the PAF, you want the most rational, cost effective pathway. That means the best way to replace old F-16s is with new F-16s, especially when you already operate those new F-16s, basically the Block 52 airframe, which then feeds directly into the Block 72 airframe. And just a quick point on Arslan's point regarding the Link 16 acquisition. So basically, those are new Link 16 terminals that the PAF is acquiring to replace the old ones, because there's some additional interoperability updates they have to do, which also tells us that the PAF definitely cares about maintaining interoperability with its partners, with NATO and what have you. So that's another factor that goes into this. And again, we're talking specifically about the F-16 part of the equation here. So the point being is that this is, whether the PAF, and some folks might take this a bit controversially, but again, my perspective here is, look, if you look at the things that we've written on KUA up to this point, is that we kind of argue that a stealth fighter plays a very specific role in the equation, and to drive stealth fighter led operations, you need the larger numbers of those 4.5 fourth plus generation fighter aircraft to help with following up on that stealth fighter's initial openings that it creates. So let's say you have a J-35, it destroys an Indian air defense radar. You need a follow-up plan, right? You need follow-up assets to come in. And it just so happens that, that those should ideally be dependable. They should have enough payload and range, and they should be compatible with your standout weapons. So obviously, in that sense, you could argue that the F-16s might not have that. But again, this is something the PF will try to negotiate with the US at this point, especially now. and that's where it is. It's like, I think just the basic point that we're trying to make here is that not to assume that this is going to be a runaway for China. This is something the PAF will take seriously. It's arguably, again, its biggest procurement cycle in a long time. It is very fundamental to the way the PAF operates, because you're talking about replacing a decades long, very reliable, very critical central fighter asset. And in this case, the PF will free up a lot of its operational budget by 2040 to obviously support the next fighter. So that's where it's going to surprise people at the options that it's going to look at. So that's why, my original contention was that don't ignore the Typhoon. I would say at the bare minimum, the Typhoon is going to be part of those evaluations, and we'll see what happens from there, basically. So Arslan had to leave, so I'll basically conclude the podcast after this next question. So the next question is from Farhan Faizi. Given the threat of precision strikes aimed at the high command, how resilient is Pakistan's chain of command? Should we be looking to flatten the hierarchy by empowering mid-level leaders, or does national security demand a reserve pool of retired generals ready to step back into uniform the moment tensions escalate? So this is an interesting question. I think it kind of reflects off what Iran had experienced in this recent conflict with the U.S. So the Iranian IRGC senior command was essentially wiped out by the Americans, but then they they pivoted to their Mosaic defense architecture, where I believe you had like 1-star, 2-star generals essentially taking command of the fight, basically, and bringing Iran to a point where it could negotiate a deal with the U.S. again. Remember, the U.S. said there was going to be no deal, and then the U.S. was the party that initiated the strikes on Iran, right? So they were thinking that they could actually basically impose terms on the Iranians. But again, this Mosaic architecture was a very key part in enabling the Iranians to sort of stand against that. And you know, I'm of several minds on this. I'm a personal supporter of the idea of disaggregation. I strongly believe in delegating downwards. It might just be my bias, having worked in the West, and when living in the West, we kind of, in the West, there's a very strong emphasis on delegation, individuality, and that kind of stuff, and that kind of feeds into how the militaries operate. I mean, I'm sure for those who follow how the U.S. military operates, or how the Western militaries in general operate in terms of how they, how officers and non-commissioned officers manage tasks and flows, you see that there's a bigger emphasis on um, different personnel and different types of personnel taking commands of specific domains, and not so and they're more horizontal as opposed to vertical. I mean, there is a horizontal hierarchy from an organizational standpoint, for sure, but the idea is that you'll have like JCOs and NCOs essentially being the lead people on certain types of tasks, right? That officers would have to delegate to them. Like the commission officers would have to defer to them, right? So it's not uncommon. So I believe that as in broad strokes, that's good to be more horizontal and flat as opposed to being more vertical. But that's in that there could be some inherent biases there, so we want to keep that in mind. And that's where, like, I'm starting to form several theories of what Pakistan might be doing. I do feel that there is a recognition that disaggregation will help, but in Pakistan's context, it's sort of seen as inherently high risk for many reasons. Um, you know, you've had episodes in the past, although this was not done at any mid-level or anything, but you had episodes like Gargle, for example, where because basically you had people taking unilateral action, and that is, I think, something that uh, sort of biases our decision makers to focus more on keeping things under control, and having that vertical chain. Whereas folks like us who sort of are at the bottom here, we prefer having the speed and mobility of not having to answer upwards. I think some people would argue that it would have been great to have that speed of action from the mid level during the recent conflict with India. But then from the people at the top, for them, it would be the risk of how far can things escalate. What kind of capabilities do we want to imbue the mid levels with? Right? Do we want the Army Rocket Force command units to be distributed across, where such that brigadier generals could essentially call on them to go and engage in Fatah 2 strikes or something? So there are a lot of questions and nuances that Pakistan has to sort of sort out. I mean, where it worked out for the Iranians was that the IRGC was sort of built as like this. It was like less of a conventional military and more of a very robust, complex intelligence apparatus. So for them, having that mosaic model was a bit of a natural setup, right? They completely divorced themselves from the traditional Iranian military, the Artash, I believe. So they didn't have that, those same considerations and concerns. They were already sort of trained and designed to operate that way, and I think they themselves saw that they sort of control, like, for example, put it this way, like their attacks against the US came after they lost their senior command. And they're still primarily defensively oriented. So they kind of knew that they weren't going to overly escalate things to such a degree where, things in the region will go out of control, right? So, and then they also had, like, you could argue, some sort of political mechanism in play where once the original IRGC leadership was wiped out, they formed a council. The younger IRGC leaders, they were basically appointed Khamenei's son, right? So there are those factors that play as well, where they had a plan in place for what would happen afterwards, and they all sort of they stuck to that plan. So it's very hard to sort of figure out what Pakistan would do. The way I would kind of frame it is that I think we might see a hybrid situation, a hybrid approach where, you have obviously your traditional vertical, top bottom chain of command systems. But I think one of the things I'm noticing is that we're seeing these horizontal commands also sort of emerge. So what I mean by that is that if you take, for example, the Pakistan Air Force's Space Command, yes, it's the PAF that sort of stewards and manages Space Command, right? Which is like the satellites and that what have you. But those assets have to be available to the Army and the Navy as well. So, the management might be done within the PAF, but the benefits sort of flow horizontally through the other surface arms as well. And what that means is that you would imagine all three service arms, the Army, Navy, and Air Force, would have to basically contribute towards Space Command. Now, the thing is, do the Army and Navy feel comfortable giving part of their budget to the Air Force? Well, maybe in the old siloed system, maybe not. But when now you have a chief of defense forces, currently Field Marshal Asim Munir, he can sort of maybe be the manager, or you could say the actual person in charge of these horizontal subcommands, or horizontal unified commands, right? Where you could have where you have a CDF taking ownership of the space assets, you have CDF taking ownership of Army Rocket Force Command, or any of the general surface-to-surface strike capabilities, right? Whether it's within the Army, Navy, or Air Force, or you have the CDF taking responsibility of air defense, right? Especially territorial air defense, or strategic layer air defense. So, for example, if the PF invests in anti-ballistic missiles, for example. So I think like that is where you could have a situation where the CDF decides to steward the creation of certain types of formations which do operate at a more disaggregated level, where they have a lot more flexibility, very similar to India's integrated battle groups, to act preemptively, to act rapidly, you know um, to operate without the same let's say deference to the very top of command. They operate based on a mandate rather than a set of orders. Um, and the one who's accountable for that would be the CDF, basically. So I think that could be an option where you have, like, again, like a hybrid, basically hybrid setups where the military as a whole still operates as like the traditional force, but then there's certain units and formations and squadrons and or task forces that operate more autonomously, or maybe more laterally, or more horizontally, rather, to be more accurate. So that's where I would see it. I'm not sure about the reserve pool retired generals, because you have to remember, and I'm just, I'm going to put a lot of caution into this, but like retired, the generals, especially within the Army. I mean, this is not a factor for the Air Force and Navy. I think you could see retired air marshals and admirals come back into the picture much easier, than actual land forces generals, because we have to remember that at the end of the day, the appointment of the chief of army staff carries a lot of political baggage, like it or not. I'm just trying to be as neutral here as I can. But at the end of the day, um, that has its own connotations and risk factors. I think fundamentally what would probably happen, at least from the Army's perspective, is that you still have the Army. It follows a traditional chain of command, but that they have, through the CDF, certain units and forces that kind of operate more laterally with a mandate. right? And so again, thanks again to both of you for those questions. And once again, I thank our listeners for tuning in this week. Yeah, if you have additional questions and ideas or things you want to pass by us, do email them to us. We do focus more now on email submissions, basically. So again, you can basically reach out to us at contact@kuwa.org. So or my first name at kuwa.org. So once again, I thank you all. Take care and see you next week.